The wealthy man gave a beggar some money to dig a grave for the bride. As soon as the vagrant approached the coffin, even the priest was taken aback. Robert walked along the graves, checking for any litter, and out of the corner of his eye saw a frail old woman clearing the grass from the fence around a tombstone. She was moving very slowly, but continued to tidy up around the headstone. The beggar felt sorry for her and decided to approach to offer his help. "Hello. Let me clear the grass," he said, gently taking her by the elbow and winking with his right eye. "No, I can manage, dear," replied the old lady, tears streaming down her face. "Sit down, rest a bit, and I'll clean up all the rubbish," he said, seating her on a bench and starting to tidy up. The old woman sat heavily and adjusted the faded headscarf on her head. Meanwhile, Robert managed to read the initials on the tombstone, as well as the dates of birth and death. It appeared that her husband was buried here. Carefully and thoroughly removing the grass, he glanced at the elderly woman from time to time. She sat with her head lowered, wiping her tear-streaked eyes. It was clear she was suffering, and it wasn't just about visiting her deceased husband's grave. The old lady seemed to be lonely and suffering from a lack of care and attention. Finishing the cleaning, Robert sat down next to her and quietly asked, "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" It sounded plain but sincere and heartfelt. "Rebecca Faber," she replied, "and this is Albert Faber, my husband." Pointing at the tombstone, she started crying again. Robert took out his handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her. "My name's Robert. Here, take this. Your handkerchief must be soaking wet." The old woman nodded and looked off into the distance. "I've gotten used to tears. I hardly feel sadness anymore," she said without turning her head. "Maybe 5 years ago, I would have been upset, and my heart would have ached, but since my Albert passed away, everything around me has become dreary. Life without him has lost its charm. He filled it with warmth and tenderness." "And what about your relatives? Don't they support you?" asked Robert. "They seem to be there, and yet not there," the old lady shrugged, turning her head towards him. Her face was almost dry, the tears seemed to have evaporated. It looked like the old woman was speaking the truth. She had stopped feeling sorrow. "Even the children have forgotten about me. I've become unnecessary to them. So, I have to take care of my husband's grave myself." "It's hard to imagine why they treat you this way," said Robert, shaking his head. "The children got used to us helping them throughout their lives," she continued. "They didn't work very often, to be honest. We felt sorry for them, so we didn't lecture them. Shortly before Albert's death, he became very ill and persuaded me to sell our country house. I agreed. By then, our son and daughter had their own homes. The money from the sale was deposited into a bank account. That's where it stayed. And the children were in no hurry to visit their sick father. He felt hurt and left all his assets to a children's orphanage. I supported his decision. And after that, the children hated us. It's incomprehensible. Did they only love you because of the money?" Robert asked, both surprised and angry. "They weren't like that before. You see, Robert, this greed spoiled them. They never helped anyone, and their children grew up with little. An unenviable fate. But, as they say, you don't choose your parents." "You're right, dear," the old lady responded. "I suppose your life isn't exactly sweet either?" "It's true, but I don't complain." Robert waved his hand and then heard the voice of the cemetery caretaker. "Good afternoon," he greeted them both. "I was walking and heard someone speaking wisely. And it turns out, our Robert has found himself a conversationalist." "Oh, I'm sorry. I should be going now." Rebecca Faber got up from the bench and headed towards the exit. "Wait, I'll walk you out," said Robert and, in the same instant, whispered to the caretaker, Elton Farrell, "You could have come over a bit later." The caretaker smiled and showed his watch. "All right, once you've seen the old lady off, come to the caretaker's shed." The man nodded in agreement and, taking Rebecca by the hand, walked with her to the exit. On the way, She lamented a little more about her children, but somewhat reservedly, as if afraid of offending them. Despite not receiving help or even visits, she continued to love them. She couldn't do otherwise. They were her own flesh and blood. Watching them leave, Elton Farrell sighed deeply and muttered to himself. He had worked as a caretaker at the cemetery for 15 years and had seen many things. There were times when he wanted to cry himself, but he always held back. He understood that he couldn't really help, yet he still cared. His heart ached for each departed soul, as he was their guardian of peace. They metaphorically shared their inner torments with him. After seeing the old lady to the bus stop, Robert soon arrived at the caretaker's shed. The caretaker was sitting on a bench eating sunflower seeds. "Help yourself. I roasted them myself, didn't buy them from the store." "No thanks, I'll save my teeth," Robert declined. "You know, let me tell you," the caretaker continued, "there's been a lot of sorrow in my life, and at first, I felt it all deeply, but then I learned to put up a barrier. Recently, I've even managed to control my emotions, something I could hardly do before." "It's just that your heart has hardened," Robert replied, and then added a Latin phrase. "Robert, where did you get so smart? Translate what you just said." "Oh, Elton, I said that the greatest misfortune is being happy in the past." "And what does that mean?" "It means almost nothing to you, but it's her entire life," Robert replied. Though Elton was surprised by the Latin phrase, he was already used to the beggar using such clever words. Robert often used Latin when he wanted to express a deep thought. He also knew complex terms that the caretakers sometimes didn't understand. In those moments, Elton would just nod his head to avoid looking foolish. Meanwhile, Elton noticed that the beggar had strangely delicate fingers. They didn't look like those of a laborer. Usually, a working person has calloused hands and rough skin, but these fingers were clean and well kept. True, they were a bit darkened, but that was because Robert constantly cleared grass and painted fences. He helped a lot at the cemetery and did it completely selflessly or for a purely symbolic fee. The caretaker never asked why Robert had such delicate fingers, understanding it would be awkward and inappropriate. Robert had joined them just a year ago. At that time, he looked completely lost. It seemed nothing would help him, but no. Working in the fresh air, a friendly team, and a supportive director were beneficial. Robert developed a desire to live, whereas before, he had been ready to leave this world just to avoid suffering. "Did you know that old lady?" the caretaker asked. "No, I just met her today." "Her name is Rebecca Faber," Robert replied. "I spoke with her a bit and realized that loneliness has become her curse." "I see," Elton nodded, "but she's not the only one with such problems. I could give you 100 cases where old parents are not only neglected by their own children but also humiliated, with their pensions taken and left with just bread and water." "Yes, I agree with you, but it's still hard for me to take in," Robert said. As he finished his last word, an expensive black car pulled up to the caretaker's shed. A man in his 30s stepped out. First, he looked at Robert, then at Elton, and arrogantly asked, "Hey, old man, who can I talk to about the funeral? I'm in a hurry and need to get a grave dug." The caretaker grimaced at the young man's arrogance but decided to respond. "You know, young man, such things need to be discussed in advance." "I said I'm in a hurry. What's unclear?" The young man grew nervous and started fidgeting with his tie. "If it's about the paperwork, come back tomorrow when the director is here," the caretaker continued to stick to his line. "I can't wait. I need it urgently." The young man insisted. "Well, all right, things happen. We'll sort out your problem now." Elton turned to Robert and quietly asked, "Looks like a client has shown up. Will you take it on? Why not help someone?" Robert replied and walked over to the young man himself. The young man exhaled heavily, and Robert almost shed a tear. The guy reeked of alcohol. The beggar forced himself to overcome his disgust, though he was almost nauseated, and asked directly, "Who are you planning to bury?" "I just need a grave," the young man answered irritably, lowering his head apologetically. He then mumbled incoherently that a coffin would be brought and everything would be sorted out then. In short, he didn't answer the question of who would be buried. The young man only said that the grave should be ready by the next day. He was in a hurry and had no time for idle talk. Robert promised that everything would be done on time. "Don't worry, I work quickly. The grave will be dug neatly." "Good. Here's the money." The young man handed Robert a bill and went back to his car. Taking the crumpled money from him, the beggar returned to the bench and showed it to the caretaker. Elton Farrell shook his head but waited until the young man left before saying anything. What a greedy person. He could have given more. He'll still come and pay in full anyway. "Oh, come on, Elton. Maybe he's grieving, and we're here thinking about money," Robert said sorrowfully. "Not everything in this world is measured in rustling banknotes. We must remain human in any situation." "Wise words, Robert," the caretaker patted him on the shoulder. "I hope they'll be useful to you." The beggar wasn't upset by the fact that the young man gave him so little money. He was grateful for the money he received and didn't complain. This was because he valued and respected people and tried to empathize with their pain. He thought the young man had drunk to numb the pain after losing a loved one. That's why he was rushing to bury them, to avoid further distress. Robert decided to use the money to buy meat bones for his Charlie at the market. The dog had fallen ill, and he needed help recovering. 6 months ago, Robert had saved Charlie from under a car. At that time, the dog had nearly died. And to prevent the animal from dying, 2 wounds needed to be urgently stitched. The man had to drag the dog to the caretaker's shed. When Elton Farrell saw the injured dog, he immediately lamented. "Are you out of your mind? What if it dies here? Where will we bury it then? Have you thought about that?" Robert didn't engage in an argument and simply commanded, "Bring the thread and needle. And don't forget the candle." The caretaker was frightened but followed the request. Robert quickly treated the dog's wounds and stitched them up just as swiftly. The animal survived and later became not only a friend but also a protector to the beggar. Elton's eyes widened, and with a quiver in his voice, he asked, "Are you a veterinarian?" Robert didn't answer. He just smiled slyly and shrugged. The saved dog was named Charlie. At first, the pet had to get used to the new name, but soon it responded to it without any issues. They lived together in his wooden hovel near the cemetery. It was hardly worth calling a house, but it provided some shelter for the man. After a sparse lunch, he took his tools and went to dig the grave. The dog limped beside him, constantly watching his master. Robert couldn't help but laugh and said, "I know you don't like digging in the earth, but this is our bread." The caretaker had indicated the place for the grave. All the free areas of the cemetery were marked. Robert grabbed the shovel and started digging, throwing the soil aside. And then, it seemed, he was overwhelmed by nostalgia. He began to reminisce about his past life, and there was much to remember. Once, he was considered the best surgeon in the city. He was respected by everyone and almost carried on people's shoulders. Right after medical school, he was successfully placed in a prestigious clinic. Many students dreamed of it, but only 3 were honored to work there. From the very first days, Robert proved himself to be a professional. After all, he had studied medical textbooks day and night. If they were laid out in a row, they would form a very long path. The clinic was considered the best in the region. Prominent cultural figures and wealthy businessmen came here for treatment. Naturally, this imposed a serious responsibility on the doctors. Knowing whom they would be treating or operating on, they gave their all. They were so afraid of making a mistake that, without their books, they probably wouldn't even approach a wealthy patient. Robert wasn't afraid. He considered himself an exceptional doctor. He didn't need to review medical literature to prepare for an operation. It seemed he was basking in the glory and had no worries. Surgeon Fisher naively believed that things would always be this way and he would never face failure. Robert gained financial independence and became well connected with the city's most influential people. At one of the social events, he met Natalie. She caught his attention with her simple manner of communication. The surgeon turned on all his charm and won her heart. Natalie reciprocated, and after that evening, they began dating. Robert was glowing with happiness. People even whispered at the clinic that he had received a rich inheritance. After all, Natalie turned out to be the daughter of a well-known lawyer in the city. Naturally, with such a connection, the surgeon's future seemed even more promising. 2 months later, he proposed, and they soon got married. Their honeymoon was spent on the Mediterranean Sea. Natalie even wanted to stay abroad and open her own clinic, with her father's money helping them. But Robert missed his homeland and persuaded his wife to return. As he said, "I can't treat these strangers here. They seem foreign to me." Natalie didn't insist, and a week later, they returned home. Robert continued working at the clinic, but his relationship with his wife deteriorated sharply. He was afraid she would file for divorce and the family would fall apart. But Natalie's father intervened, clearing the storm clouds from their marriage. For a while, the couple reconciled and even began making future plans. Eventually, Natalie announced her pregnancy. Robert was over the moon with happiness. From that moment, all misunderstandings between them ceased. His wife prepared for childbirth, and Robert took care of her in every way. He even tried to leave the clinic earlier so Natalie wouldn't be alone at home for too long. Such care made his wife's head spin, and she forgot that she had once criticized him for indecisiveness. When their daughter, Courtney, was born on schedule, Robert was delighted. He had wanted a son, but the daughter ignited even more love in him. Natalie's father gifted them a luxurious house in the countryside, which they moved into from their city apartment. Robert soon sold the apartment and bought a high-end car with the proceeds. For years passed since then. The man became the leading specialist at the clinic, again, thanks to his wealthy father-in-law. Natalie had changed a lot during this time. She began hinting at Robert about having his own clinic, but with a focus on plastic surgery. He didn't like the idea and refused. It was hard to say what Natalie was after, but it wasn't preferential treatment for her appearance. Her beauty drove many men crazy, and Robert was openly envious. But he just couldn't understand that his wife was trying to push him to a new level. One day, she brought up the subject and said directly, "Well, dear, understand that you're not a Superman, and you don't have an endless battery. And my dad won't live forever. Besides, his profession is very dangerous. You're running the clinic now, but it doesn't belong to you. Just imagine for a moment if we lose Dad's support and he's an influential person in the city. Everyone will immediately turn their backs on us. While it's not too late, you need to start your own business. You're a top-notch surgeon, and wealthy patients will still come to you." Robert didn't respond to his wife at the time. He merely shook his head in despair. The man went to visit his parents for a few days, who lived in a village. His mother, Jennifer Foster, didn't lecture him, but his father, Matthew Fisher, supported Natalie. "She's right. Think about my words, son. I'm an old man, I've seen a lot. There have been ups and downs in my life, but I always trusted my wife and listened to her advice. Your mother is a wise woman. It was she who saw in you a future medical specialist. Just look at the heights you've achieved, even though you wanted to go to a construction college." Robert didn't argue with his father's opinion and decided to talk to his wife about having his own clinic. On Monday, he was returning to the city. It was mid-September. Light rain was falling, and a cool wind was blowing. Sitting in the car, Robert listened to classical music and seemed not to worry about anything. He was just planning what he would say to Natalie, knowing that she would start laughing and claim she was right, and that all his indecision was just a lack of maturity. He thought of how to avoid her ironic mockery. Moreover, he needed to apologize to his daughter as well. She wasn't to blame for her father's fear of responsibility and his escape from problems. But suddenly, the phone rang, and Robert had to turn off the music. "Yes, I'm listening." The call was from an unfamiliar number. In the background, a siren was wailing. "Hello, this is Lieutenant Freeman from the traffic police." Robert felt a chill inside. He even gripped the steering wheel tightly, then pulled over to the side of the road. "What happened?" "I don't understand what's going on," the surgeon stammered, trying to find the right words for such situations. "I have to inform you that your wife has died in a car accident," the lieutenant said loudly so he could be heard. "It can't be. I don't believe it." Biting his lower lip, Robert began to cry like a child. "Please accept my condolences, but it is indeed true," continued the lieutenant. "And my daughter?" "What about my daughter?" Robert shouted into the phone. "She is in critical condition, taken to intensive care," replied the lieutenant and gave the address of the clinic. Robert hung up the phone and rushed to his daughter. He was sure he could help her himself, given his exceptional professionalism and that he was considered almost a god. With these thoughts, Robert arrived at the clinic where his daughter Courtney was located, half an hour later. The doctor, who knew the renowned surgeon, allowed him into the intensive care unit. "Just please, Fisher, don't make a fuss. She's on machines, and there are no forecasts." "I understand, you didn't have to warn me," Robert replied. "Listen, can we transfer her to my clinic? I'll perform the surgery myself, okay?" "No, that's out of the question. The girl is barely holding on," the doctor refused. Robert watched his daughter through the glass for a long time and couldn't believe that her life was hanging by a thread. Realizing that Courtney wouldn't be transferred to his clinic, he inquired about the next steps and went to the morgue to identify his wife. Natalie's body was severely injured and burned in several places. It was unclear how the daughter had survived, even though she was in critical condition. He identified his wife. She had a gold chain with a pendant on her, which he had given her for her birthday. Additionally, the documents were intact and hadn't burned. Looking at her passport, Robert cried and quietly whispered, "Why did you punish me? I was saving lives." In a state of shock, he was taken home. He lay on the couch all evening and then began calling the doctor at the clinic. He was concerned about his daughter's condition, what was happening with her, and if there was any chance of survival. For the first 2 days, he was reassured that she might soon improve. But on the third day, the doctor himself called with the tragic news: Courtney did not survive, never regaining consciousness. At that moment, Robert went gray and became an old man. He couldn't endure such a blow. The surgeon lost faith in his own exceptionalism, and he didn't have the strength to arrange the funeral. That's why all the arrangements for the burial were taken over by his father-in-law. He assured Robert that he wouldn't leave him alone with his grief. But then fate's cruel twist intervened, and during the funeral, the lawyers suffered a heart attack. The doctors arrived within 7 minutes, but they couldn't save Natalie's father. He died in the ambulance. Robert received another emotional blow, and it broke him completely. These events forced the surgeon to view his own life from a different perspective. Abandoning his exceptionalism, he began to perform fewer complex surgeries. Wealthy patients still came to him, but he continually found reasons not to take them on for treatment. Robert's parents noticed the profound changes in him and urged him not to give up. However, the surgeon lost the desire to work at the clinic. He was constantly haunted by dreams of his wife and daughter. They reached out to him and said, "You didn't love us." But it wasn't true. Robert adored Courtney, and although there were misunderstandings with Natalie, they never escalated into scandals. No, something was wrong. But Robert couldn't understand what exactly. He felt that the death of his wife and daughter was entirely his fault. If only he had agreed to Natalie's suggestion and hadn't gone to visit his parents. Who would have thought that his wife would take it so hard? Or maybe he didn't really know his wife at all. Robert reflected on this and suddenly concluded that he hadn't paid her enough attention and had ignored much of what she said. His parents had once said correctly, "If you don't engage in your child's life, either the street will raise them or they will find their own solace and companion." Natalie seemed to have decided to act on her own but hadn't accounted for chance. Her car crashed on a curve while she was on her way to negotiate about buying the clinic. Robert couldn't have known this because his wife had lost faith in him. And now he had lost trust in himself. Instead of trying to cope with his depression, he found solace at the bottom of a bottle. Robert became addicted to alcohol, even though he knew the consequences. He had been a proponent of a healthy lifestyle and then fell into drinking. It took him just 2 months to become an alcoholic. When his parents found out, they tried to save their son and bring him back to normal life, but he didn't want to hear anything, only increasingly turning to the bottle. One day, when his mother came to his home, she saw Robert lying on the floor with empty bottles and decaying leftovers scattered everywhere. She grabbed him by the collar and shook him with all her might. "Get up! Oh my God, what are you doing to yourself?" Jennifer Foster shouted right in his ear, but the man didn't care. He was sleeping a dead sleep, unresponsive to her cries. His father also tried, but to no avail. Matthew Fisher even wanted to take his son to a rehabilitation center, but Robert refused. Robert had completely stopped keeping in touch. He soon resigned from the clinic because he couldn't operate in such a state. And who would trust the life of a patient to a trembling alcoholic? It didn't matter that he was considered the best surgeon. All his exceptionalism was now written on his swollen face. As time went on, Robert didn't even try to pull himself together. On the contrary, he sank deeper into despair. Unable to endure such humiliation and stress, Robert's mother suffered a heart attack. Neighbors informed him of her death. The relatives didn't want to see the drunken surgeon at Jennifer Foster's funeral. She had taught at school for many years and was naturally known as a respected educator. It would have been unpleasant for Robert to appear drunk at the farewell ceremony. However, he pulled himself together and showed up sober for the first time in a long while. Everyone was surprised and thought that his mother's death had such an effect on him. The relatives had a fleeting hope that he would quit drinking and return to his old life. For a few days, the man held on, even helping his father around the house to alleviate his grief, but then he took up the bottle again, and everything started over. Matthew Fisher gave up on him and didn't try to stop him. 2 months later, he passed away. He was found slumped over at the table, his head bowed, holding a photo of his wife. It was likely that Matthew Fisher couldn't cope with such a loss. And his son added to the strain, unwilling to manage his problems. Honestly, Robert himself was unhappy to have sunk to such depths. He didn't understand what was driving him into this abyss, as he had never had problems with alcohol before. After that, his whole life went off the rails. Robert was left alone in the world, with no one to turn to for help. All his friends, whom he had known and constantly helped, turned their backs on him. They wanted nothing to do with a drunkard and wouldn't even greet him on the street when they passed by. And Robert had helped many of them and given them new lives. It turned out that's what held the friendship together. While he was at the top, basking in the limelight, they needed him and did so without a shred of conscience, without any gratitude in return. Robert wasn't upset with them for this. He couldn't hold a grudge against people. He was considered the kindest doctor in town. But no one could have anticipated how the deaths of close family members would affect the surgeon. He had become an orphan overnight, and the local cemetery was now filled with 4 graves. Robert didn't remember who came to his home. He generously gave away the money he had saved with his wife. All the local drunks knew that they could come to him and get free alcohol. By that time, relatives and friends had completely distanced themselves from him. And Robert didn't even have time to realize it when black realtors worked him over and left him without a home and car. As a result, he ended up on the street. He had nowhere to go. A woman at the market, whose daughter Robert had once operated on for free, recognized him as the famous surgeon and helped him find shelter. She gave him the keys to an old shack on the edge of town. Robert was even pleased with this gift, as it allowed him to visit the cemetery more often and visit his wife, daughter, and parents. He was afraid to go to his father-in-law's place because past clients might show up there. Robert had no reason to encounter them. He had become a vagabond, and it was unlikely anyone would pat him on the back. After a while, he managed to get a job at the cemetery. The director accommodated him because he needed workers. Thus, Robert became an employee at the local cemetery. In a short time, he managed to make friends with everyone, especially Elton Farrell. The caretaker developed not only trust but also heartfelt kindness towards him. They would sometimes spend evenings together over a cup of coffee and a heart-to-heart conversation. Elton Farrell was constantly amazed. How did a vagabond have so much knowledge? Although he looked like an ordinary bum, he spoke as if he had just graduated from university. The caretaker wasn't interested in his past and didn't have the habit of asking uncomfortable questions. Elton believed that if a person wanted to, they would tell their own story. But Robert was in no hurry. He was embarrassed to look people in the eye, let alone reveal his background. He thought that as soon as the caretaker learned who he was, he would be met with ridicule. At 35, he looked like a 50-year-old man, and while it wasn't a critical age, Robert hadn't wanted such a conclusion for himself. Gradually, step by step, he settled into life at the cemetery. He was no longer interested in alcohol. Somehow, Robert managed to give it up and set himself the goal of returning to a normal life. At least he hoped that daily work would help him cleanse himself and regain his composure. And he wasn't wrong. Each day, his internal state improved, but it was still too early to talk about a full recovery. At the cemetery, he helped people who couldn't fully maintain the graves due to their circumstances. If needed, he painted fences, carried away trash, and did all this for a symbolic fee, not demanding full payment for his services. The cemetery visitors became so accustomed to him that they greeted him by hand and called him Uncle Robert. He didn't correct them, understanding that it was easier for people to remember someone who helps from the heart. And so, when a wealthy client came and asked him to dig a grave, Robert couldn't refuse. He believed that one should always extend a helping hand to others. While digging the grave, he didn't even notice the caretaker approaching him again. "You know, Robert, you're right about happiness in some way." "About what?" asked the vagabond, setting the shovel aside. "About what you said in Latin," Elton replied. "I see. I was expressing folk wisdom," Robert said with a smile. "That's what I'm saying, you're a wise man." The caretaker concluded and pulled out a small bag from his pocket. "Come here, Charlie, I brought you a bun." The dog obediently approached him and took the pastry from his hand. Meanwhile, Robert finished digging the grave, climbed up, sat on a bench, and thoughtfully said, "Life is really a complex thing. Some manage to understand it, while others just drift like sludge and wait to be washed up on a lucky shore. Look at that, Charlie, your master is quite the philosopher," the caretaker laughed, pointing at him with his finger. "I mention this, Elton, because something needs to change," Robert continued. "By the way, what do you think? Why is this guy in such a hurry with the funeral?" "I don't know. It's still unknown who will be in the coffin," the caretaker replied. "Maybe he's in a hurry to get rid of his mother-in-law. Anything can happen, especially in families where there's no understanding." "And how about your family?" Robert asked. "Oh, it's fine," he replied evasively. "My wife doesn't nag, and that's good." "Well, that's true too," Robert said with sadness. It seemed that Elton didn't want to talk about his family, which suggested that things weren't going smoothly there. Even though he tried to hide it, Robert immediately guessed what was going on. Despite having been a surgeon, sometimes he had to play the role of psychologist. It was getting dark. Robert glanced at his old wristwatch and said, "Well, Elton, it's time to know your place." "Exactly. How about we go have a coffee?" the caretaker suggested. "I'm all for it. Just let me put away the tools and I'll join you in the shed," the man replied. Half an hour later, he was in the caretaker's small room, drinking strong coffee. Sitting at the table, they talked about life. Elton became so animated that he started discussing fishing and hunting. Apparently, he hoped to get Robert interested in these activities and make him a companion. After all, it's always more fun to fish and hunt together. But Elton didn't know that the former surgeon was not very interested in these pastimes. At night, Robert found it hard to sleep. He kept thinking about that wealthy man. The strange behavior of the guy made him suspect that something was wrong with the funeral arrangements. As the caretaker had rightly said, it was necessary to give advance notice. Furthermore, the director would have called Elton himself. No, there was clearly a mismatch here. The more he thought about it, the less he felt like sleeping. Only towards morning did his eyes start to close, and for a couple of hours, Robert fell into a restless sleep. Charlie came over to the couch, yawned, and also fell asleep. It seemed that the dog was awake, seeing that his master wasn't sleeping. Outside the shack, the chirping of birds woke Robert up. He washed his face and tidied himself up. He didn't have breakfast and immediately went to the grave digging site. The corpse was expected to arrive soon, and Robert, as usual, had to be on hand to help if needed. The funeral car arrived an hour and a half later. During this time, the surgeon had tidied up the edges of the grave and prepared the tools for lowering the coffin. As usual, the staff from the funeral home arrived with the car. They knew Robert well and greeted him warmly. "Hi. Is everything ready?" they asked. "Yes, I stayed a bit longer yesterday so there wouldn't be any fuss in the morning," he replied calmly. "By the way, who's being buried?" "A girl," they answered. Everything went as usual. Robert had participated in such funerals before. The lacquered coffin with the deceased was carried out of the car and placed on similar chairs. The wealthy man approached it and began muttering to himself. Suddenly, another car arrived, and a priest got out. Robert was surprised. Was this dandy going to perform the funeral service? He had seemed like a strange guy the day before, and today he had suddenly changed. Also, the deceased didn't seem to be his mother-in-law. In any case, she didn't fit the age. Robert thought it might be the wealthy man's wife. She looked to be around 25 to 30 years old. The caretaker soon appeared, holding documents. "Good morning, Elton." Robert greeted him. "Hi. I barely made it. I'm short of breath," Elton replied. "That's a problem with your lungs. You should see a doctor," Robert suggested. "I know, but I never find the time," Elton replied. "It's strange that this guy brought his deceased wife from another city." "In what sense?" Robert asked, surprised. "Well, he himself is not from around here, and neither is his wife," the caretaker answered evasively. "See, it's all in the documents." Robert skimmed through the documents and immediately frowned. He was alarmed that the wealthy man had chosen not to bury his wife in her hometown. It seemed like someone was trying to cover up or distract attention. Perhaps the wealthy man was getting rid of unnecessary witnesses. And who knew what his relationship with his wife had been? Meanwhile, the priest recited a prayer and began to walk around the coffin, swinging the censer. Robert approached him and was taken aback. The appearance of the deceased was as white as paper. She clearly wasn't ill, and there were no visible bruises. The vagabond suddenly thought that the girl might have been pushed to her death. He looked at the wealthy man and shuddered when he saw him fiddling with his phone, completely ignoring the coffin. Moreover, Robert found it strange that so few people had come to say their last respects. Could it be that she wasn't valued or loved during her life? That couldn't be true. She must have left some kind of mark behind. As Robert thought about this, he became even more convinced that something was off. But how could he find out? He couldn't exactly ask the wealthy man strange questions during the funeral. The guy really wasn't reacting to his wife's funeral. He just stood silently, occasionally glancing at the priest performing the rites. Although it seemed from the outside that he genuinely loved her, as evidenced by the costly oak coffin and the expensive services of the priest, Robert felt that his suspicions might be unfounded. However, the former surgeon was not ready to give up and decided to test one of his suspicions. Taking advantage of the moment when the priest approached the wealthy man and started talking to him, Robert moved closer to the coffin. He was struck by the fact that there was a flush on the deceased's cheeks in some places. This shouldn't happen after death. Moreover, he could feel an energy emanating from her. To be sure, Robert touched the deceased's hand. It was warm. Could they really be burying her alive? Robert thought to himself, stepping back from the coffin to attract the caretaker's attention. Elton was surprised when the vagabond grabbed his sleeve and pulled him aside. "What's wrong? Upset about this girl?" the caretaker asked, puzzled. "She's not dead," Robert almost whispered. "So, breathe here," Elton Farrell beckoned with his finger and held out his nose. "What are you talking about? I don't drink." Robert protested, but he still breathed out towards the caretaker. "You're really sober," Elton shrugged. "But why do you think she's not dead?" "I have the documents, and they clearly state the date of birth and death. True, the cause of death isn't mentioned, but that sometimes happens." "Exactly, and that's what I'm saying," Robert insisted. "Maybe you should go rest?" "No, Elton, I'll show you everything now," the vagabond replied and led him to the deceased. "Everyone knows what body temperature a corpse should have, so check and see that I'm not lying." The caretaker touched the deceased's hand and was stunned. It was indeed warm. He was so taken aback that he couldn't utter a word. Robert spoke for him. The vagabond shouted across the cemetery, "Stop this farce. The girl is not dead, and you're burying her alive." The priest even dropped the censer when he heard this. Moreover, he started crossing himself and muttering, "Lord, save and protect." As for the wealthy man, he became very tense and shot a hostile glance at the vagabond. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He was even scared for a moment. At the same time, his suspicions about the supposed deceased were confirmed. From the very beginning of the ceremony, he had doubted that the person in the coffin was really dead. Everything seemed too much like a cheap comedy. This girl's case felt different. The wealthy man seemed to be getting rid of unnecessary ballast. But why would he go to such lengths? Finally, the caretaker began to recover. At that moment, the wealthy man made a run for it. Robert shouted at the top of his lungs, "Elton, call an ambulance and the police. The girl is in a coma from drugs. I know what I'm talking about because I used to be a doctor." The caretaker was slightly confused. They needed to call everyone and chase the fleeing wealthy man. Robert noticed his confusion and whistled twice. Immediately, Charlie came out of the bushes. "Go, stop him," Robert commanded. The dog took off and chased after the wealthy man. It took Charlie just 1 minute to catch up with him. The man fell to the ground, and Charlie grabbed his sleeve and began to tear at the fabric. To avoid unnecessary injury, Robert ran over and pulled the dog away. The caretaker appeared right away. "Look at that, he wanted to escape in his car," Elton pointed to the black luxury car parked near the cemetery entrance. "It's all right, he wouldn't have gotten far anyway," Robert replied. "Isn't that right, Charlie?" The dog barked happily and wagged his tail, and when the wealthy man tried to get up, he growled at him again. A few minutes later, the priest joined them. "This is unbelievable," he lamented. "I've never encountered anything like this before. Do you even realize, young man, what you've done?" This question was directed at the wealthy man, but he didn't answer. The dog prevented him from moving. "And what about the girl?" the priest asked. "She's fine," Robert answered calmly. "She's in a coma right now, but I'm sure they'll bring her out of it at the hospital." "How do you know?" the priest asked again. "I used to be a good doctor," the man replied evasively, not disclosing his exact profession. Apparently, he wasn't ready to fully reveal himself yet. "Now it makes sense where you got your knowledge of Latin," the caretaker patted him on the shoulder and laughed loudly. "What about the police and ambulance?" Robert asked. "They'll be here any minute," Elton replied. "Don't worry. The girl, as you said, is not in danger. And this guy is in no hurry. He's arrived, and it looks like he's here for a while. Soon, the sirens of the ambulance and police could be heard." Robert decided to stay and ensure that the girl was examined and that all necessary measures were taken to save her. The police detained the wealthy man, handcuffed him, and put him in their car. Meanwhile, the paramedics examined the supposed corpse and concluded that she was not dead but indeed in a coma. This was enough to suspect the wealthy man of attempted murder. The only thing left was to find out what drove him to take such a drastic step. Approaching Robert, one of the medics smiled and quietly said, "I recognized you right away, Robert Fisher." "Really?" the vagabond replied, puzzled. "You saved my daughter 2 years ago," the medic continued. "She had an accident, and you miraculously brought her back from the brink of death." "Wow, that was a long time ago," Robert said thoughtfully. "But I wasn't able to save my wife and daughter." "Yes, I heard about your tragedy," the medic replied. "I genuinely felt sorry for you. I even wanted to offer you a job at the ambulance station, but you suddenly disappeared, and no one in the city saw you again." "I wandered around and ended up here," Robert admitted. "I only came to town in case of extreme necessity." "I see." "Robert, hang in there," the medic patted him on the shoulder. "The girl will live. It will take time to bring her to consciousness, though. The most important thing is that we saved her. Everything else is up to fate," Robert replied. Meanwhile, the police prepared a report and had already questioned the caretaker. It was Robert's turn, and he shared his suspicions and theories with the police. He also asked them to punish the wealthy man to the fullest extent of the law. "Don't worry, the investigation will sort everything out," the police assured him. "I really hope so." Robert looked at them sincerely, then turned his gaze to the rescued girl. She turned out to be the victim of a con artist who deceitfully wanted to take her property. This became known when the caretaker returned from the police the next day, where he was questioned again. The director was also called, but he couldn't explain much. He was accused of negligence and threatened with legal action. Can you believe what a fool he turned out to be? The caretaker said regretfully and with dissatisfaction. "What did they say? How is the girl? Is she all right?" Robert asked. "I can't say anything about her," Elton replied evasively. "It all depends on the medics and how they manage. But, as I understand it, Rachel has suffered a lot." "Oh, her name is Rachel?" "Yes, that's what the investigator said. And the villain is named Arthur," the caretaker added. "Well, now he will be held accountable for everything." Robert was curious about what had really happened to the girl. That's when Elton Farrell shared the grim story with him. It turned out that Rachel had met Arthur by chance at a friend's birthday party. The guy charmed her with his looks and mannerisms. He managed to win the heart of the modest girl. She hadn't even realized how quickly they started dating. At first, Arthur courted her elegantly. He gave her flowers, took her to cafes, spending no more than he could afford. Rachel wasn't at all bothered by this. Her father had once been a large landowner, leaving her a substantial inheritance, so she wasn't in need of money. At the same time, Rachel hoped that Arthur would soon propose to her. Everything seemed to be heading in that direction, but who would have guessed that he had completely different plans? As revealed during the investigation and the suspect's interrogation, Arthur intended to steal all her property and valuables. But he needed to marry her first, then file for divorce, and deceitfully claim whatever he could. Rachel was unaware of this and practically doted on him. Having withdrawn some funds from her account, she bought Arthur an expensive car. Meanwhile, he spent her money on gambling and having fun. Pretending to have a demanding job, Arthur often disappeared from home. When he returned, he claimed to be tired from business trips. Rachel had no doubts about his purity of heart. However, when it came to the wedding, the girl suggested a prenuptial agreement. In that case, Arthur would get nothing after the divorce. He would end up with nothing but what he came with. As a result, the idea of sending Rachel to the afterlife crossed his mind. But he needed to figure out how to do it without anyone suspecting anything. The perfect solution seemed to be a fake funeral. Arthur had everything planned out, secretly learned the codes to the safes and bank cards. Rachel didn't hide much. She thought that with marriage practically settled, they would become even closer. Arthur's plan worked. The next step was for him to acquire powerful drugs through a medical acquaintance. Simply putting Rachel to sleep wasn't enough for him. He wanted her never to wake up. After all, if she did wake up, especially during the funeral, he would be in trouble. So, he added a horse dose to make sure it worked. Unknowingly, the girl drank the beverage he kindly brought. After that, she remembered nothing because she lost consciousness. Arthur hoped everything would go smoothly as he managed to avoid an autopsy and forge a fake death certificate. By paying off the right people, Arthur bypassed the procedure, and Rachel was simply issued standard documents without a cause of death. And this is where the cemetery director was at fault. He didn't properly check the paperwork and approved the burial. He might just get a fine, but he could also end up in prison. After listening to the caretaker, Robert shook his head and said, "What a love story." "I know, I was surprised myself when the investigator told me everything," Elton added. "I would never have thought of treating my own wife like that." "But Rachel wasn't his wife." "Exactly," the caretaker replied. "And what's most frightening is that Arthur specifically brought her here to bury her. No one in our city would have recognized her, and everything would have remained a secret." "I hope he gets what he deserves," Robert said with optimism in his voice. "I hope so too." "I told the investigator not to show him any mercy," the caretaker added. "By the way, he sent his thanks to you." "Why is that?" "Well, of course," the caretaker said, raising his eyebrows in surprise. "It was you who figured out that she wasn't dead." "Oh, I just remembered my professional skills," Robert waved off. "It's good that Rachel is lucky. And you should visit her," Elton put a hand on his shoulder. "She'll benefit from it." "What should I tell her?" Robert asked, surprised. "Nothing much. Just inquire about her health," the caretaker replied calmly. "You're a doctor, I don't need to teach you what to say and ask in such cases. Or maybe you've lost your touch." "No, I haven't lost it," Robert said confidently. "I'll visit her tomorrow. I'll also ask her how she could have trusted Arthur. Yes, and give her some advice. It'll do her good," the caretaker winked. Arthur was facing a harsh trial. No one was going to show him any mercy. For everything he had done to the girl, he was facing a substantial prison term. Meanwhile, Robert learned from a medical acquaintance from the ambulance where Rachel had been taken. It turned out that she was in the third clinic where he had once worked. Remembering this, Robert gathered his courage and went for a visit. But to his surprise, the duty nurse did not recognize him. She just huffed and said disapprovingly, "Oh no, I'm not letting any vagrants into the hospital." "But I need to see Rachel," Robert pleaded with her. "And who are you to her? A relative? Maybe a spouse?" The nurse continued her line of questioning. "No, her would-be husband is under investigation," Robert replied calmly. "When he's released, let him come himself," the nurse said cynically. The duty doctor appeared and, seeing the former renowned surgeon, exclaimed, "Wow! Robert Fisher, I hardly recognized you," extending his hand in greeting, the doctor continued. "You've changed so much. I even thought you had disappeared." "Sorry, but everyone in town was saying that Robert had become an alcoholic and was wandering around." "Partly true, Benjamin Garrison," Robert responded. "I recognized you too, eventually. I remember you were moving up the ranks back then." "And here you are," the doctor laughed. "The head of the department decided to promote his protege and just gave me a raise." "Wait, are you feeling ill?" "No." "Then what brings you here?" "You know, Rachel is being treated here." "I'd like to see her," Robert replied. "Yes, that's right. She was brought in recently," the doctor said thoughtfully. "But she is still in a coma. I'm not making any predictions yet, it's too early to say." I understand, but I still need to see her, Robert insisted. Fine, I'll take you there, but first I'll warn the nurse. The doctor went into the reception area, and Robert sat down to wait. He could hear Benjamin Garrison reprimanding the nurse. The nurse apologized for not recognizing the vagrant as the former surgeon. But you saw for yourself that he has changed. Yes, that's true, but thanks for being vigilant, the doctor replied and left the reception area. It's funny how it works, first scold, then praise. But it's to keep her on her toes. Taking the elevator to the third floor, Benjamin led Robert to the doors. Just for a short while, and if anyone asks, you weren't here. I understand, I won't let you down, Robert answered calmly. Approaching the window through which the ward was visible, he gazed intently at the girl's face and felt that he had seen it somewhere before. Perhaps a very long time ago, many years ago. It felt like fragments of memories from a past life were surfacing. Robert tried to piece them together into a coherent image, but he couldn't. He had to wait a few more days before Rachel came to. She was informed of everything that had happened. Shocked by the news, she asked who had saved her. Benjamin Garrison told her it was Robert, a former top-class surgeon. Rachel asked for permission to see him. The doctor called the number left by his former colleague. A few days later, Robert visited her in the hospital. Seeing her rescuer, Rachel cried. "Thank you. You gave me a second chance at life." Unable to rise, she simply extended her hand to him. "It's all right. I only did what I had to do," Robert said, patting her hand. Rachel squinted, furrowed her brows, and then whispered softly, "I think I recognize you." "It can't be," Robert was surprised. "Yes, it's true. You went to the 17th school," she continued. "I'm just 4 years younger." "That's right, I went to that school," Robert confirmed. "And I do recall something. Wait, you used to often run to the assembly hall and watch our plays. I also remember your father helping the school with repairs." "Yes, I loved those plays so much," the girl replied. "And my dad has passed away." His heart stopped. "What a surprising meeting, after so many years," the man said. "By the way, Benjamin said you're on the mend. Although the effects of the medications aren't fully under control yet, I think things will improve soon, and you'll be able to go home." Rachel thanked him once again for saving her and suggested keeping in touch. Robert gave her the same phone number he had used to call the duty doctor. A couple of weeks later, she fully recovered and was discharged. Benjamin Garrison himself saw Rachel to the car. At home, she faced the process of restoring her documents, as she was officially dead. She even had to pay to expedite the process. By that time, Arthur had been convicted and sent to prison. The cemetery director received a fine. Robert, on the other hand, was pulled out of the hole he had fallen into by Rachel. She helped him with an apartment, where he moved in with Charlie. Knowing about his past, she decided that the former surgeon deserved a second chance. Arriving in his city, Rachel suggested opening a clinic. Robert immediately thought of his wife. "She wanted the same, but I wouldn't compromise. But there won't be such a mistake again." Starting work in the newly opened clinic, Robert realized that he hadn't lost his skills, despite having damaged his body with alcohol. Apparently, the desire to escape that mire helped him retain some semblance of sanity. Robert equipped the clinic to serve socially disadvantaged individuals and those who simply couldn't afford quality treatment. Rachel had no doubt that this was exactly what he would do. It turned out that she had been attending the performances at school not just out of interest, but because Robert was appealing to her. Their interactions gradually grew into romantic feelings for each other. Despite living in different cities, they tried to spend their weekends together. And after another 6 months, they realized they didn't want to be apart for even a day and began preparing for their wedding.